Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome back to the PetsApp Webinar Series. Today we're going to be talking about data. For that privilege, I'm joined by Dr. Jules Benson. Jules is Nationwide's Chief Veterinary Officer, an experienced animal health strategist with expertise in innovation, technology, data and marketing. A graduate of University of Liverpool's vet school, Jules is a UK native but has lived in the US for almost 20 years. Welcome, Jules.
Hi, Tom. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, mate. How's things with you?
Good. I wanted to take a second and to acknowledge the work that you guys do. You guys make this look really easy. So and coming from a marketing background, the brand building and I think the advocacy that you guys do, you make it look really effortless, but it's really hard work and it's a lot of work and it takes dedication and discipline and a really great team. So kudos to you guys for that. I know it's hard to see from the front how slick you guys make it look, but it's a lot of work. So I appreciate that.
Oh, I appreciate that, Jules. That's very kind. Full credit to the PetsApp pack that makes it possible. I just have to put on my polo and turn up.
Brush your hair. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So we're talking about data. I think we have to start by conceding present company accepted, of course. Data is not usually a word that gets people terribly excited. Where does your interest? I'm making you sound like some kind of weirdo. Sorry, Jules.
Where does my prurient interest in data come from?
Exactly, that's the question.
I've always been a technology guy. So even when I was 16, I think I built my first 486 SX25. And shout out to City Computers in Lancaster, where I had my first Saturday job. And I think from there, it was just a natural kind of progression to just always being in computers and just, learning the whole Microsoft suite and everything just through exposure more than anything else. And I think I was one of those, those 19-year-olds who are like, wow, Excel's really cool. And everyone else is like, you're an idiot. And I think, now I hear people say unironically, Excel's the most powerful tool in the office. And then when I talk to AI people now, they're like, oh, you use Excel, we use Python, and now I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm sorry, I'm not that cool. But I think for me, as I've got into veterinary medicine, I don't think at school, I did an extra degree in veterinary conservation medicine with Professor Malcolm Bennett, who's now at Nottingham. It was the first year for that. And I think when I got into the epidemiology side and into some of the really, as you start looking at captive breeding and some of the genetics behind that, there's a lot of maths and a lot of data that comes from one of those things where you're trying to, really measure meaningful outcomes. And so I think to me, that was kind of an exposure. And then when I got into pet health insurance, my first foray was with Pet Plan in the US. And again, with a small company, you kind of get thrown into all different things. That's the great thing. And I don't have to help you, Tom, about a startup is that you get to do so many different things. Everything's on fire, but you get to do different things. And there wasn't really anyone doing any data reporting. So I had taught myself Crystal Reports, which is, some version of Business Objects, I guess it is now, from SAS, and some SQL and a few other bits and pieces, and worked closely with the technology team and really just through osmosis learned a lot about data, and then from there helped to design and build systems. And it's funny, you talk to Dr. Mary Gardner at Lap of Love. She comes at it from the other way. She came from information systems and into veterinary medicine, but we both have very similar kind of views around how to use data within veterinary systems. So I got into it, and then from there, it's kind of just been this progression of informatics and evidence-based and what can we do. And of course, in my business and insurance, the data, that's the lifeblood of what we do, right? We have to know what the data say in order to manage the risk, and so on and so forth. So for me, from here, the real interest is how do we use those data to create meaningful insights into pet health. And so my vision really for what I'm doing at Nationwide is to be able to use our historical data, which stretches back 30, 40 years now, and to be able to say what are the things that we can see that we can, similar to what you guys are doing in communications, like what can we see and what patterns can we observe that tell us things that we don't already know and or that we're not doing correctly or consistently. So that's really where my passion comes from. And as I look at the data kind of marketplace and the data field at the moment, I do, and we'll talk about this obviously more later, but when I look at the promises that we're telling ourselves really around big data and AI, my big concern is that without a foundation of data, it's really hard to get to that, that nirvana. And so I think one of the dangers that we have really as an industry is that we keep kicking the can down the road on informatics and on standardization of data. And I know there's been some efforts in the UK, and we can talk about things like VetXML and how they've influenced, the way that we treat data in the past. But I think unless we really put our arms around it and say who is in charge of this, who is establishing data governance within veterinary data, and are they the right person? I mean, again, this is a broken record. So many things we talk about within veterinary medicine are we going to let somebody else drive the bus? And right now we are, and that could be okay. But if we want to get what we want out of it, we have to have some input into that, right?
Yeah, it's like you said, at a startup, there's great power in being the one that understands the data and is extracting the insights out of it. And I think that's more broadly true across any sector. To just there's this quote that the plural of anecdote is not data, or the plural of anecdote is data, depending on what side you're on. I wondered if you'd be up for sharing a story with us, a data success story where you've put data to work in the service of pet health.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of cases, and the one I jumped to is in the application of precision livestock farming, which feels like it's so far from what we do, right? But this field of PLF is rapidly taking place among many of our production species, right, in cattle and swine, particularly, and really PLF is about what can we measure en masse and how do we make use of those to increase our output is productivity, right? So when those swine or those cattle get on the wagon, how are we measuring productivity? How are we measuring uniformity? What is the value of these things? And I think that's why PLF has seen early success, because the outcomes are more easily measured than they are with us. So when you start looking at even some of the vaccine trials or the drug trials that we see with some of these species, again, I was shocked by the number of variables that can impact the results, but the fact that you can measure the variables more easily, I think that to me is working on something. And the specific project I can't talk about, but seeing PLF in action, that was kind of interesting to me to see. Wow, and I think that's one of the interesting areas to talk about is outcome data within companion animal health, because that's much harder and much squishier perhaps than it is in production animal health, right?
That's my next question for you, really, Jules. Is what sorts of data do you think are most interesting and relevant in the veterinary context? If you could have anything, what would you like?
So, I think maybe it's more useful to look at what I think we do have at the moment, because I think there's where we are now and there's the utopia where we want to be, and I think what we have now, by and large, is data as a function of process. Right, probably the most valuable data that we have within our clinical sphere is invoice data. And the reason we have invoice data is because the computer has to do the maths in the background to calculate the quantity versus the unit cost and get the price. Like that's one of the only reasons we have, the tabulated data from the invoice. It's not because it will be a great output to have those. It's because the process has designated the data output. So I think
a great point on incentives there, right? People have the incentives to invoice, so we get absolutely. That data.
Well, and let's take a step back. Let's talk about and again, I'm there's no expectation for me that people are familiar with these terms, and there's really things that I've only come to know within kind of my journey. But I kind of latch on to these concepts of data governance and data stewardship. And so data governance really is, this is the standards and the metrics and the policies that we use to create data, or we all agree that these are the things we will do. So if you think about the temperature, taking body temperature of pets, for example. So we could all agree that we're going to do a number of units per unit of measurement. So we'll say that the first field is, it's going to be a value between 0 and 200. And that the units are going to be centigrades or centigrade or Fahrenheit. And we could say, well, do we want to measure in Kelvin? It's like, no, who wants to measure in Kelvin? So as a standard, we're going to say it's going to be these things, and that's it. And as an organization, as an industry, we're deciding, and again, it goes back to the question of who is deciding, we're going to decide that's how we're going to measure the temperature of pets. And then stewardship really is the management and the oversight of those data. So on a daily basis, and again, going back to temperature, we want to make sure that we're putting that temperature into the right field so that it can be a recorded data point. Because again, when I was in practice, I used to put temperature into the notes, and that's not super helpful because, as you and I know, when you come to try and report on those data, yes, you can go into natural language processing and extract data and everything else, but it's immensely easier and more helpful if those data sit in the right place and we all agree where those data are and what they look like. And I think a good example of stewardship, I think they all feel like kind of intimidating terms, but I think a good example of stewardship, if you think about it, is we have at least 1 or 2 data stewards within our practices already. Your accountant is a data steward. Your accountant is taking financial data out of your system, putting it together in an organized way and reporting back to you on what it says about the business. The person who's managing your inventory, they're a steward of your data. They're looking at what you have on the shelves, and they're saying, based on these are the decisions we're going to make about the business. So this isn't an inaccessible term. We just have to decide who is doing that for us. And I think you see more and more people who are stepping into that gap. I think Vet Success are doing a great job, for example, of being data stewards of practice data and saying, we'll help you interpret these data that you are collecting, and we'll give you, guidance on how best to collect and maintain those data.
I was going to say, do you think we need to tell these people then, if they're sort of data stewards, but they don't know they're data stewards, does that come with a set of responsibilities, things that they should be thinking about doing,
Sure.
Checking, that sort of thing?
Well, and the thinking about the situation here in the US, there's already someone telling our accountants what they have to do. It's the Internal Revenue Service. So there's data governance around things like financial data, and they have to put them into a form at the end of the year and file them, right? So there's data governance coming down to our data stewards. But in terms of with people within the practice knowing what their roles are around data, absolutely. I think data literacy and data culture are 2 of the areas that it's not, you're right, it's not sexy. I think people think about it and they're like, well, let's just put the thing in the thing, put it in the system. And I think for me, that kind of rings alarm bells, because I look at, and again, from my previous positions within pet health claims, looking at medical records. So Banfield used to, again, historically, I don't know what it is at the moment. Banfield had a great system that everything could be recorded in discrete fields within, has your pet been, had GI disease? Yes, no, has it? So everything was in there. But often, because it felt like because it was so comprehensive and that a veterinarian had to make so many clicks, the notes didn't always agree with what the data field said, because the veterinarian, I think, was just like, like, I'm just going to put it in here and not worry about what the data field say, because this is...
Yeah, we've all been on those long forms where you just sort of click through it as quick as you can. What do I have to put in to get to the next step?
Well, and that's why I was encouraged to see companies like VetSpire and the early versions I saw of their software, where they were starting to use... They were basically accepting that our field will not, electively say, I'm going to make this diagnostic code in this field and it's going to be this outcome and I'm going to measure it this way. They accepted that we're probably not going to change our ways overnight as a profession, and so they used natural language processing to analyze the notes as they came through and highlight different areas, which then you could record in the data backend. So you could say, this dog was vomiting, and it would highlight the word vomiting. And so vomiting was something you could pull out as an individual data element, and that starts to build a more comprehensive data picture in the background. Now, again, since their acquisition, we can talk about what acquisition and commercial interests mean. I don't know how much further down the road that's going to go and how many other people it's going to benefit. But I think going back to your point of motivations, if you think about the human health system, and especially the human health system here in the US, the motivation to code diseases or to have more discrete data fields is driven by the pressure from insurance companies or from hospital groups to collect those data. Basically, unless you collect those data, you're not going to get paid. That's the incentive structure, right? And that's certainly not what we want within pet health. I think we want better data, but we don't want it to be this battle. I think we want to come to a situation where we're organically collecting better data on the front end to help us make better decisions and get to better health outcomes.
Yeah, so John in the chat says that was VetSpire's original goal, and he says that maybe over more recent years, the mission has sort of diversified from that. Really interesting that to get the data we want, we have to start with data. So data around user behavior, user experience tells us how they're going to be most likely to format, input the data that we then want to get out, right? So to get the data you want to start by looking at the data. Interesting. And do be like John. If you have a comment, if you have a question, please throw it into the chat, throw it into the Q&A, and we'll pick that up as we go through.
And Pam had a great comment about snowmen. I mean, again, I think when we talk about what the world looks like at the moment, I think we see small pockets of great enthusiasm, like AVI or like, Evidence-Based Veterinary Medicine Association, who are, I think they see that in order to get the promise of where we say we're going to be in 10 years, we have to deliver on short-term goals now in order to build that foundation. I think that's the same with any organization. Whenever having worked with a number of large organizations, I think we always think everyone's, possibly further ahead than they really are. And I think when we look at organizations like, and again, this is more just an observation than a criticism, but when we look at an organization like Covetrus absorbing a company like Vet Data, I know that we haven't all necessarily seen what we thought we might see from the Vet Data promise coming out of it. So I think, John's point about, Vetspire's promise and their goal being kind of compounded or knocked off course a little bit by commercial interests. And really that's where we are now at the moment. The people who have most control of really both data governance and data stewardship to a degree are driven by commercial interests. And that's not inherently bad. I think we just have to look at what the motivations are. I think we talked a little bit earlier about, the sharing of data. Is sharing of data something that we will see, and we can talk about, GDPR and some of those other things. I think those things will come. I'm less concerned about the sharing of data than the ability to actually collect meaningful data that means more things to more people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And thanks for your point there, Pam. Pam's from the Association for Veterinary Informatics. And she was just saying how maybe veterinary students could help assist clinics with standardizing terminology used in records. One of the problems I've come across with standardization is to standardize it, the language becomes somewhat unnatural, quite formulaic. So then if you've got multiple data sources, so how pet owners see the world and talk about things, yep. And then how veterinary teams talk about things, and then how third parties talk about things, to bring them back to this sort of common coding, it can be a challenge.
And nothing's that clean. So SNOMED CT, so what Pam's talking about, and again, I'll take it a step backwards in a second, because I think there are bigger issues even with those types of projects. But when you talk about something like SNOMED CT, we have codes all throughout the process. We have codes for science, for clinical science. We have codes for differential diagnoses. We have codes for granular diagnoses. And to your point, Tom, I don't think that our process works like that. And I think even to Pam's point of saying, having a student code diagnostic codes to SNOMED codes, I think is a great idea. But I even would question how many hospitals are using any diagnostic codes at all and don't just have the information in unstructured data within the notes of the practice. So I think that's what people are trying to deliver on around, I think, natural language processing, is saying, oh, we'll get to a point where we can teach, an AI, process to understand what these outcomes are, or what these condition codes are. And I think that's great. I think I think it comes back to, the motivation of who is doing that and why. Because again, IDEX and Antec and others could do that today, right? I'm sure they have people sitting in rooms, crunching numbers. But again, I think you have to look at what is the goal, and of course they're guided by commercial interests. I think one of the most interesting, we talked about what data do we have. So we talked about invoice data. There's lab data, right? And I think everyone gets excited because lab data is something that is somewhat standardized. And I agree, but I also, the value of lab data is, I think, is limited. I think when you look at, one of the early, I think, success stories perhaps is renal tech from Antec, right? So this fits into our field of predictive analytics, or now I think I'm not sure if it's still cool to call it predictalytics, but that's certainly the term that's being thrown around. But renal tech, basically said, okay, as Antec, we have all of these data from cats, going back years and years and years, that are standardized. We can look at what those numbers were and, basically create endpoints of when did this cat develop, kidney disease, based on our, BU and creatinine and our standard values, and what do they all look like across these standard parameters historically. And so based on those, we can predict with a confidence interval of X, or 85%, whatever else, that if you have two values this far apart and your pet is this old. So it's, again, this isn't, I get a little shifty around people using words like AI and machine learning when all we're doing really is deep analytics. So I think those two things are very different things. And I don't know how I'm sure we've had conversations about this before in the bar of raging against the inappropriate use of artificial intelligence, but
depends who you're presenting to, right? Just get those buzzwords in there. Charlene says the VMDB was going to standardize to the vet version of SNOMED several years ago. Coming back to Pam's point about the student, the student project, very interesting. I think we could harness more stakeholders in veterinary medicine to their full potential. But the student then goes back to school. At some point, the student has to leave, right? Does the data culture leave with them? And like, what can we do here to create this sort of solid, consistent data culture in veterinary practice?
And it has to be part of the process. And I totally agree with you, Tom. I think you can do data projects, right? You can do a mapping project. So say we have a great clinic that actually uses condition codes within Cornerstone or some other system. You can absolutely do a mapping project to, or again, conceivably, you should be able to say to Cornerstone, can I have the condition codes? And then just do a major mapping exercise to SNOMED codes and say, hey, for anyone who's using these, this is the SNOMED codes. And I think that some of the PIM systems are doing that in the back end as well. But to your point, Tom, unless we collect it, unless we have the foundational data to do those mapping exercises on, unless we're changing the behaviors around how we record and collect data, it doesn't have immense value. So I think, again, it goes back to, talking about what VetSpire had originally started doing, of saying, how do we create a better mousetrap around, working with veterinarians the way they work? Because if we don't have the incentive structure to make them do these things, and again, I think the Banfield system is a really good example of trying to force people into these are the data fields you will collect. And it wasn't rebellion. I think there was just some apathy in some cases. I saw of like, well, I'm just going to do what I know because my hair's on fire and I got 3 pets in the next room that need, X, Y, and Z. So I totally agree with it. I think that these middle mapping exercises and these ways of saying we can get you to a standard like SNOMED CT are important, but I think we are missing that data culture aspect of how do we create a data culture, and how do we create data literacy? So I think even within a practice, when you start talking about financial reporting, for example, the irony is, for me, that as veterinarians, we do this every day. You see a CKD cat and you say, okay, well, what is our current status? And somebody brings you a cytology from 6 weeks ago, and you say, well, these data don't match what I need to know. I need chemistry, and I need it from today because this is the status of I need these data on this cat. So in the same way, when we're seeing, practice data and someone's saying, oh, the data of 6 weeks ago say this about our RX spend, and the RX spend looks off, and we say, okay, well, why is dentistry 30% of our revenue? Because someone's miscategorizing all antibiotics as dentistry. Like we have to be, I think, more open to asking questions to data and not being intimidated by the data we're being served. And again, I think, sorry, go ahead, Tom.
No, I just think that's interesting how it comes back to user experience once again. And I'm sort of having these flashbacks to my time in practice, both as a vet and running veterinary clinics. I remember wanting to track the patients that we'd made dental recommendations to. And we had to come up with this hack where we invoiced a zero cost dental brochure to then search for the dental brochure to surface the patients with dental disease, and the sorts of things you have to do to try and hack around it. But just on your point around the quality of data, I want to go to the problem with the highest quality data that we have. And we're both scientists by training. I like to think that within the profession, we're all fairly, at least in principle, committed to evidence-based medicine in the veterinary field. But how do we overcome the fact that a whole lot of the studies that we have struggle to muster a sample size much bigger than half a dog? What can we do there?
It's a really good question, and I think so. Outcome measures is what we're talking about, right? So and it was interesting we talked about renal tech before, and again, this is not criticism of renal tech. I think it's just when I looked at the renal tech when it came out, I kind of went looking at the same time for, to your point, evidence-based medicine around early intervention in CKD, and does that lead to greater life or quality of life? And I couldn't find really any meaningful studies that and again, I may have been looking in the wrong place, and so I'm always happy to be proven wrong, but I most of the time happy to be proven wrong. But I couldn't find any studies that said that this intervention had meaningful impacts on longevity or quality of life. Not that it's not important, but just that, to your point, we don't have the data to support that. So, I mean, I look at, I don't know how many people are familiar with the EPIC study that the Beringer carried out on with VetMedin. And this study was amazing. It's of a power high enough that it's comparable to many human studies, many human health studies. And it was really talking about, early intervention in congestive heart failure. And that was a multi-centric study across hundreds and hundreds of cases. But even then, when you look at the dropouts of not being able to collect data, or people dropping out of the study, or not, the trouble we have in collecting these data in large numbers, to your point, Tom, is incredible. And I think that's where I think we do have the ability. One of the things that we're starting to really work on at Nationwide is how do we use retrospective data to start to pull out some of those things, and again, looking at the data that we do have, how do you use invoice information to create meaningful endpoints? So thinking about, what is the most meaningful endpoint? It's finding an invoice item for euthanasia, right? And I think one of our problems as an industry is that we all have these little pockets of data. So in a primary care practice, where you spend most of your time with partners, they can feel that experience, and the data going up to whomever, to whatever PIMS provider, they have that experience. But that's not the whole pet health journey. They don't have the specialist records necessarily. They don't have the brick and mortar RX or the online RX. And I think, to me, that's one of the reasons that I get super excited about insurance data, is because it, under, again, certain limitations, it captures that whole breadth of pet health experience. And again, the limitations, I always want to be really clear about what the limitations are. And I think when we talk about insurance, I think we all get excited of well, there's everything in there. And it's well, only if people make a claim. That's a pretty big data point of, if they don't claim for it, then we don't know about it. Or, if they reach the limit on their policy, do they stop claiming? And so we don't know what so you have to take all these things into consideration and look at this as what are the organic parameters that are potentially stopping us from getting the full data set. And I don't know that we do that a lot. We see a lot of data sets, to your point, of this is a survey of 2,000 people that say, 50% of people, adopted a pet during COVID. And it's well, I don't see that as a super meaningful data set. I get that it's a great line. It's a great, kind of marketing bite. And having worked in marketing, I know how those messages get distilled, that ultimately, you get to the point where, as a data person, you're yeah, but that's only true for these people within this data set. And marketing yeah, but we'll put it in small letters at the bottom. And it's all right, okay. But it's and I think we've seen it a lot during COVID. This may be, in my lifetime, the biggest. It's not a failure of data. It's I think an appreciation of how the public feels about data and the interpretation of data. And that there's very little appetite for texture. So I think when you look at CDC recommendations about mask wearing or whatever else, outside of the politicization, I think just the fact that things can change and the scientific process isn't a monolith that we're going to say this thing and it'll be true forever. I think the use of data to improve our ongoing experience, I think, has challenges, and I think we as an industry are better at that than most, but we still have to work hard at it.
Yeah, so it sounds like we've got a compromise between sort of quantity and quality of data in some areas, and then we've got gaps in others. It's interesting you're talking about invoicing data. If you looked at my time as a veterinarian and you looked at my invoicing data, you'd think I'd never ever cleaned an animal's ears, because I was always really bad at remembering to charge for the ear cleaner. Or insurance, the insurance claims data. In the US, insurance penetration is still, relatively low compared to some of the European markets. And is this a self-selecting population in some regard, either highly compliant or risk averse, or, whatever behavior it might sort of be confounding there, I guess?
I absolutely agree. And that's one of the things when I talk about pet health insurance data, when I look at it, I'm basically equating to basically the top tier of treatment. So I think one of the successes we've had over the past couple of years is partnering with Vet Success, and of basically being able to make that comparison between insured clients or uninsured clients, and kind of interpolating between those two things and saying, okay, what are the insured clients doing? And my goal really is to be able to say, taking insured client data, can we obviously make assessments based on what those people are doing, but B, potentially also interpolate down to, John Q average, pet owner, and see if we can generate some more data from there. And again, it's difficult because, you're right. So even Nationwide, which is the largest insurer in the US, it's still less than 1% of the pet population. But given the pet population in the US, we have over 1 million pets insured. So in terms of that, and that's right now, right? So if you look back at the exposures and insurance, the insurance peak is a single year is one exposure. So if you go back and look at the exposures of 30 plus years, we have millions and millions and millions of exposures to which we can, again, aggregate these data on. But again, frankly, some of our data is a function of process. And, now we're using better digital tools and some projects that are helping to lift the texture from what we previously had, which is super exciting.
We've had a question from Tanya. I promise you, Tanya, we will get onto that. But I just want to sort of get things more on the positive side, because we talked about the risks, we talked about the challenges, what we may be doing wrong, the need for greater governance and stewardship. But if we get this right, what sort of opportunities do you see ahead of us?
I think they're myriad. I think that going back to the negative for 1 second, I think one of the issues that we have is that we don't always know everything we're going to get ahead of time. I think we can make the promise of data, and it feels so far in the future because we have to do so many things to move that rock that other priorities take over. And I think if you look at where we are at the moment as a profession, we have, huge mental health issues. We have a huge, workforce challenge. We've got massive diversity problems. And I think even just taking those three on their own and you say, yeah, but we've got to do stuff about data. Everyone's like, yeah, we can do that, Jules, like next year or the year afterwards, like once we've solved all these other issues. And I think to me, the problem is we can't get where we want to be from here, right? Unless we start to build some foundational data elements. And for, to me, the larger membership organizations, and again, I give kudos to ABMA and AHA. They've done great work, I think, in the past of really trying to espouse programs like SNOMED CT, but I think they've, again, fallen off the radar, understandably, for all the other things we have. But unless we have more active, and again, I don't want to overlook people like the Association of Veterinary Informatics. They're doing really great work. I just don't see the rest of the industry running with it, which I know is frustrating for those folks. So what was the question about good things? What was the positive question?
Let's put a pause on the positive, just to say, these other issues around diversity and inclusion was one that you mentioned there, and I think burnout as well. I hate to be the guy with a hammer that just sees the nails everywhere, but data could help there too, right? I mean, if we could see, what happens because you've seen the surveys, and it's no doubt burnout, compassion fatigue is an issue, but it's not an issue for everyone. We don't, it's not a homogenized experience. And so what's the differences in these experiences, and where are we getting it right? And what does the day look like? What does the data tell us there?
Yeah, so I totally agree. And I think more data are always better. And I don't know if I'm enough of an amateur social psychologist to be able to say, are there things buried in those functional data that are going to get us the more squishy outcomes that we might need to understand around workforce management or around DEI or around burnout or any of those things? So I don't want to make promises. I think the data will help us see things, but I also want to be realistic about what they are going to tell us. And I think everyone talks about the law of large numbers. The law of large numbers will help us look at trends, but the other thing they can do is also help us point in the direction of what is not contributing. If we have a preponderance of data that is, just a flat line about, everyone basically, overall, of veterinarians, they have the same commercial experience on a day-to-day basis, and they're having different levels of burnout. That probably tells us that the level at which they're practicing isn't affecting it. So I think the negative is also helpful. So I don't want to make promises about what our data could or couldn't do. There's
evidence that with some of the data methodologies that you can compound biases, right? But all the more reason for us to interrogate what's going in. Garbage in, garbage out. Absolutely. If we can actually be thoughtful about it ahead of time, then the promise can be realized sooner rather than later. I did promise to come back to Tanya's question. The question is basically, whose data is it anyway? How should we address privacy concerns about data collection for the veterinarian, especially with commercialization?
So, and I'm not going to pretend this is an area of expertise for me. I think I'm more in the nuts and bolts area. I think because the stuff I'm talking about, and I think as we look at things like evidence-based medicine, because so much of it can depend on de-identified data. I don't feel like that's as much a concern. So I think, and I think if you guys haven't listened to Martin Traub at Vet Success, he has a really good discussion. I think it's actually on the Vet Success website about, how do you treat data? Like what are our overt versus covert ways of accessing data? So I think it is an important question, but I think for me, if we can all agree that de-identified data has value and that it's not, infringing on the rights of people to protect their data, and in fact, if people don't want their de-identified data being used, I think if we build the business case that really de-identified data will help us better, and again, for me, evidence-based medicine is probably the pinnacle of this. I think there's huge levels of dissatisfaction in terms of practice. If you look at chronic diseases, for example, we did a study at Nationwide a couple of years ago that looked at the satisfaction from both sides around chronic disease on both the consumer level, the pet owner level, and at the veterinarian level. And they're both annoyed. Like, managing allergies, everyone hates it. So and Tom, I think, we talked yesterday about what are things that people like PetsApp can do to help these? Like, you guys are gathering the squishy data around communication that is going to help solve some of these things, but ultimately evidence-based medicine will help us get to some of the end of these things as well. And looking at some of the work that the Collaborative Care Coalition have done, for example, are trying to drive evidence-based medicine around the collaboration between primary care veterinarians and specialty veterinarians, and can we measure increases in outcomes or improvements in outcomes for pets with cardiac disease or with skin disease. And I think we're starting to see some cool stuff coming out of there. But again, they're using these de-identified data. So I don't want to, I'm certainly don't want to dismiss your question, Tanya. And I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that question. I don't think privacy is my wheelhouse. But the conversations I've been in, I'm less concerned around it for the purposes of these larger data pictures, I think, that we're talking about.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there is a conversation to be had around where governance sits, whether it should sit with us as a profession, should it sit with the sort of sector regulators, should it be encoded into law like GDPR or the State Act in California. But I think, and also you talked about de-identification. There's also the arms race with re-identification. There's just as many people trying to work hard on taking that data and then doing things that you probably shouldn't do with it.
But I would say that the re-identification of data, or the use of data that allows us to better understand different demographics and certainly underserved demographics of pet owners, I think there is value there. And I think when you look at the work of people like Mike Blackwell at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, who really is looking at what are the perceptions around giving care to people in the lower socioeconomic sectors, and we've all, I think, from the US, those of us who know about the PVSA have watched the last 10 years or so, kind of dismayed, but massively interested in what's happening in that sector, because obviously the needs increase, but the funding doesn't always increase. It's kind of the takeaway I have from that. But I think it is a sticky area, and I really enjoy talking to a lot of my colleagues around how do you, without collecting data that can be misused, and by that I mean when you talk about data that identifies people's either economic status or a racial status or sexual status or whatever else, I think without having those things, it can be hard to measure what impact you're having or what the needs of different demographics are. But you also don't want to say, well, as a marketer, I want to exclude people in this area because I don't think they're going to buy my product because of X, Y, and Z, right? So I do think there's a sticky situation in there that I think there has to be a voluntary, and again, I think Martin does a better job of this than I would, but there basically has to be a voluntary buy-in from the base level consumer of how are you going to use my data and what are you going to use it for. And I think we have to work up our value proposition for this is why it's important to us, and this is why we believe that you can contribute.
Yeah, no. So in moving on to sort of the opportunity here and the differences that we have to other sectors, you're going to laugh at this, Jules, because I always recommend a book in any conversation we have. But there is a book I highly recommend called The Innovator's Prescription by the late, great Clay Christensen, Harvard professor.
I haven't read it.
Yeah, so the innovator's dilemma is the one that I think most technologists are familiar with, and then this follow-up innovator's prescription is about healthcare capitation. And he suggests that healthcare innovation will take root fastest in markets with relatively light regulation. And given we're primarily talking about pet health data here rather than human health data, do you think there's an opportunity for us to lead rather than lag our colleagues in human health?
Absolutely. I think the issue I see, and maybe going back to the point I made earlier around, I think data always feels like something we can kick down the road, because it's not necessarily solving today's problems, it's solving the problems of 5 years from now. So you need that growth period in order to implement and then start to be able to kind of really reap the rewards. Maybe a different way of answering the question. The areas I see that are most innovative, and this makes perfect sense, of course, is in the startup world. But then startups, and again, maybe VetSpire is a good example. I don't know what they're doing since acquisition, but and Vet Data maybe is another one. You have people who have a vision of what they want to do and what they want to achieve, and then when acquisition occurs, to me that feels like once acquisition occurs, basically the goals of the small organization get subsumed into the goals and the priorities of the larger organization, right? So you almost inevitably lose some momentum, and the fact that there's greater, there has to be communication between different levels and hierarchies and everything else. Like you instantly lose the steam. And you being within a startup, Tom, and having worked in bigger companies, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Because I think somebody at VIS described a few years ago that bureaucracy are the white blood cells, towards the invasion of innovation, right? Really, someone comes in, they say, we're doing this really cool thing. And then bureaucracy is like, well, you have to fill in all these forms and you have to get this permission, et cetera, right? So I worry that our culture of acquisition of innovative companies acts almost as a kind of almost a regulatory mechanism in itself, right? That you're taking innovation and you're making it exist within a regulatory mechanism where it's hard to thrive. So I totally agree. I don't know that I'm seeing that pattern over and over again, and that's what worries me about. Can we do this? Yeah, we absolutely can. But I think I see big companies, like the Covetrus and the IDEX and the Mars of the world, and I think they're so busy clearly pursuing their goals. And again, I'm not offering any ill intent. I think any organization has to have clear goals on what they're doing. I'm just saying that their needs and their goals don't necessarily reflect exactly what we might want to achieve as an industry overall. So I think that's why when I look at education and when I look at large membership groups, and I'd be interested to know your view of what BVA are doing about this as well. I think when we don't see as much action from those kinds of groups in guiding some of these conversations, I think that's a missed opportunity. And again, it's easy for me to stand here and cast stones. That's not my intent. I'm just from my perception point of view, that's kind of what I see. So I'd say about BVA, I'm not as close to, so I'd be interested to know what you see from a data point of view from them.
Yeah, I think throughout the pandemic, especially, BVA have been incredible advocates for the profession. What I would say is this idea of bureaucracy. I don't think anyone, or maybe there is someone somewhere, and we should have a firm word with them.
There's a lawyer somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Comes in and says, "I'm going to implement bureaucracy." When you're trying to do things with lots of people, it's progress versus process, and process at some point overtakes the ability to make progress. So I think it is hard to do these things en masse. Kate here said, this is the Vet Success Data Governance and Privacy blog post that Dr. Benson referenced earlier. So that's there in the chat for any of you getting slightly bored of me and Jules talking. You can jump on that.
Thanks for preempting that, Tom. That's good. Yeah,
well, I might have a read myself. But before I do, so as a relatively young company, PetsApp is, other than sort of sticking our fingers in our ears when it comes to any acquisition offers, what would your advice be to us? We've had 500,000 virtual care interactions take place on the platform. We have about 200,000 pets registered, nearly 300 clinics using it. there's a lot of data. We collect customer feedback at the end of every interaction from the pet owner. So there's a lot of data there, and we want to do good. Earnestly, we do want to do good, and we want to help the veterinary community. What would your advice be to someone in our position?
I mean, Tom, I think you're already doing it. I think one of the things that's been encouraging to see is companies like PetsApp start to try and quantify some of the squishiness that we have, right? Because I think as an industry, we haven't necessarily been very good at being able to collect feedback. I think, when we talked about outcomes, we talked about medical outcomes earlier, but I think from a commercial and from a practice level point of view, an outcome is probably, a satisfied client, a retained client, and a healthy pet, right? And again, depending on where you sit in the practice, those things may have different priorities, frankly, right? I think as veterinarians, we always probably go straight to, we want healthy pet outcomes. But we all know that there are commercial interests in keeping a practice open as well. So I think you're already doing things that we've never done before, really, around quantifying satisfaction, around measuring meaningful outcomes as they pertain to the health of the overall practice. But I think we've talked a little bit before, but I'd love to see somewhere along the lines of, and again, I hate, and I'm not being paid by Vet Success, but I think what they're doing in terms of, and again, I actually want to give kudos to Matt Saloy at the AVMA for taking the vision of partnering with a company like Vet Success to start publishing meaningful data about the industry. So I think, Tom, you guys are already doing it. I think just starting to, partner and collaborate as you already are. Again, I feel bad because I don't have anything new to tell you because you guys are already doing it. So I guess that's a good thing as far as you guys are concerned. But publishing those data and really giving us insights into things that we're already missing. I mean, and again, for you, that's also a commercial interest, which is a great convergence. But at the same time, helping us communicate better with our clients, and frankly, assessing the needs of our clients. I think we talk about this a lot, and I worked on a project with Beringer a few years ago about better understanding different cohorts within our service segment. Right, we can't treat our customers as a monolith, and again, going back to identified versus de-identified data. I don't know what you guys collect, but getting information about how do you best identify how to interact with people? Do you just base it on their preferences? What are the things they're not saying? We know that survey data can be unreliable. So even coming down to, working with people like, I don't know, I'm sure you know Ken Rotondo, you've met him at VIS, the work he does with his, very cool mind genomics projects where you use massive regression analysis of how people react to kind of put people into different buckets of what different messaging works on them. I think some of the projects that you and others, that people like Ken, are helping us better identify how people respond to what we're telling them, or the things that we can do better to help them respond, to help them understand. I think all the things I said about evidence-based medicine in terms of chronic disease, communication and messaging, it is a massive, massive part of that. And I think it's an area where we can use all the help we need. So as you move further down that road of customizing the approach to everyone's individual needs, I think that's super important, because communication really is the cornerstone of I think where we have fallen down a lot in the past. And I'm glad to see that it's changing.
Oh, for sure. And I appreciate you allowing me to use this webinar time as a micro consultancy. But I was looking at some interesting data today, and it seems super trivial. It was data around what are the most common emojis used on PetsApp. The paw print, I think it was a smiley emoji was first, and paw print emoji second, and the poop emoji was way up there as well. And it sounds trivial, right? But there's this new way of communicating. And we need data on what are the non-verbal mechanisms that people use to communicate digitally? What does empathy look like in the virtual realm, and what are the expectations there? So it opens up a whole new set of data, as well as giving us insights into sort of physical interactions.
Well, and we I don't know, where did you graduate, Tom? I forget. London?
I was at Cambridge for my sins. Yeah, there you go.
And sorry for any of my friends in the US. I think that because we're so much smaller, there's even more vicious rivalry between schools. But everyone agrees that Cambridge is terrible. But
except Come on, the light blues.
But we had that training at vet school, right? So some of the schools were doing, the training around nonverbal communication, about making sure that people are comfortable and that you're reading their body language. I think you're right. There's a whole new paradigm of learning around how people are communicating from a nonverbal point of view. And we still struggle with every day. Like, email is the most imperfect communication tool ever. Like, I think those of us with very dry senses of humor can have really bad faux pas in emails, because we say things and we say them in our head, and it makes you sound like an insane person in an email. So I think anything that you guys are doing, I think the emoji is a perfect example.
Okay, so we're running a little bit short on time. So I want to do a quick fire round, if that's okay. I want to bust some jargon with you, Jules. And basically, I want you to help me categorize these into whether they're very now, as in now is the time to embrace them, not yet, as in you see the opportunity, but it's not quite cooked yet, or never, as in, well, I guess that's self-explanatory, that one. So let's start with an easy one, the cloud.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things that we've been talking about, and maybe one of the things we haven't touched on, we've talked about PIM systems, right? But we also talked about, the fact that there are new and emerging PIM systems. We haven't talked about the fact that many of our practices are still on version -10 of whatever system we had. And so I think the cloud is a natural progression. I think the ability to use that storage facility and to make it more secure and all that. Again, I have a decent understanding of security, but I don't see any issues with the cloud versus a thumb drive or whatever. And Clint would talk about this better than I do. But the cloud makes a lot of sense. I think the progression is going to be slow, because I think as an industry, we're slow adopters. And I think 10 years from now, we'll still go to a practice and they'll have a 15-year-old Dell server in the back that's running, the 2006 version of Cornerstone. So I think it's coming. It's just going to be slow. Yeah. That's
the fear. This is my worry, that practices think, yeah, we've got a cloud-based PIMS, and it's like job done. And you're like, come on. The cloud was like so. 10 years ago, it's still important. It's great,
but let's talk about the value of the cloud. I mean, really the value of the cloud is if you're using cloud-based computing, you have the ability to adapt more quickly. And I think that is the one thing that I would take away, that if you have the option to adopt a cloud-based system, you're getting those updates, you're getting those APIs, you're getting those things that you're not having to have patches, which again, as in my experience, we haven't been very good at necessarily keeping up on. So I think the real value of cloud computing is that you're always getting the most recent version of whatever you're using.
Exactly, it's that iteration, isn't it? It's if one thing that we've talked about a bit is looking at how users are interacting with the platform and being able to make adjustments and iterate and be more responsive. John says, all in, Snowflake, Matillion, Tableau. So we're all right. John's on board. Next,
John, Snowflake. I've had experience with Snowflake, and I think again these are all great ideas. We're just so this the curation layers, and we're talking about data lakes and curation into Snowflake and the accessibility through business intelligence tools. These are all great things. We're just in so many cases, I think we're so far behind the 8 balls in industry that the gap is so wide. And so when you say cloud computing and it's so passé, we're still not there as an industry. I think that's right. My observation, right?
No, that's right. I remember, in a past life, I used to do web design, and actually I was in web development before I went to vet school. And while I was at vet school, to help sort of reduce the debt burden that we'll all be familiar with, I designed veterinary websites, and I was ringing around saying, do you want a website sort of thing? And the practice said to me,
Street corner, 10 quid, mate, 10 quid.
Exactly. Got a little bit of this, a little bit of that. No, and the practice said, we don't have computers, so we don't need a website. It's like, but pet owners do. Like, come on, there's expectations that you will struggle to meet if you don't embrace some of this stuff. So onto this slow fire, quick fire round. The blockchain.
Yeah, I like the idea of secure certification that's distributed. I think it makes a lot of sense. And again, I would pass off to my esteemed colleague Jason Johnson, who I think is probably the authority on this in the vet space. But I think it makes a huge amount of sense for the future of how we look at education. I'm still too old to fully, I think, grasp the I think that the perceived value of non-fungible tokens and of crypto and some of those things. But I think certainly for a lot of the things we do, whether it's an education is the easiest thing to understand, right? Because you get credits and they're in this, there's this inviolable way of recording. So I think it has immense value. I don't know that I have, and again, speak to my own limitations, I don't know that my brain is fully around how else we could use it. And I was talking to some friends the other day around like, what are the NFTs in veterinary medicine? Like, could you buy an NFT of wellness care? You buy this NFT at the beginning of this pet's life, and it gives you access to this veterinary clinic. For again, there's things you can do. I just don't know how viable, realistic, et cetera, some of those things are.
Yeah, for me, there's just a level of clever you have to be that I'm not sure I'm fully there. What are the if it's not crypto,
right? Or is it all made up? That's where my brain goes. Like, do I not understand it, or is it all made up? And I think it's probably because I don't understand it.
Yeah, if it's not crypto, where are the incentives there to be verifying this sort of distributed ledger? I don't fully understand that, and there's some interesting stuff going on with Ethereum moving from proof of work to proof of stake. But again, not fully sure I understand it, and it'll be 3 years before we know whether that made sense in that very obvious application.
And it'll take people probably 10 or 20 years younger than we are, frankly, and again, people talk about the gaming generation, and I still play PlayStation stuff, but the concept of NFTs and things within a commerce platform, I'm still really struggling with. So I don't think I'm the right person to understand that yet.
I do own an NFT. I can have that claim to fame, but it was given to me. It was free.
Is it Bowie bucks?
Sorry.
Is it Bowie bucks?
No, it's not, unfortunately. But it's a piece of digital artwork. I don't fully understand how it's more valuable than if they just emailed it to me.
Scarcity, Tom.
Yeah. Scarcity. Yeah. Okay. Next, the Internet of Things and wearables.
Yeah, wearables is a good one. I think the promise of wearables is immense in veterinary medicine and in particularly in diagnostic medicine. I think we have the technology, but I think we all keep. I don't want to say we all keep. I think we underestimate the difficulty in making use of those data. So, and this maybe comes back to you've got governance and you've got stewardship, but in between that you've got a huge mass of subject matter experts and analysts and data scientists who need to make sense of these things. And I think a really good example I heard was that one of the clinical trials wearables, a dermatologist was using it, and this dog was doing great, was measuring the head shaking and scratching mostly. And then in the middle of this dog exploded in its data, and it was like scratching everywhere. And they called up the owner and said, I thought Fluffy was doing so much better. And they're like, there's nothing wrong with him. And so they kind of went through the questions of, what's going on. Fluffy got a new toy and was shaking the hell out of it, and it was mimicking the data that you were seeing. So again, I think there's an immense amount of promise. And when you look at conditions that can really benefit from long-term monitoring, whether it's diseases that look at pain, whether it's neurological conditions, whether it's cardiac conditions, I think there's immense value there. I think that the trouble we're having, or that I've seen, is presenting the value to the consumer. I think we've both had devices on our pets, and my cat does nothing for 98% of the day. And so, when we look at our wearables and the serotonin, rushes that we get, or dopamine rushes that we get from looking at our data and how well we've done, and our pets don't necessarily have the same tokens. And so I think I'd be interested to know what they're doing in pediatric care around some of those things. I think that's a much greater parallel for us with our consistently pediatric, relationship with our pets, right?
Yeah, I think it touched on a question with a lot of data is, so what? And then absolutely. With anything that is depending on adoption, the what's in it for me. I mean, we work very hard at PetsApp on the what's in it for me for veterinary teams, because you can have any kind of strategic initiative that you want to implement. If people are feeling stretched and they can't see the what's in it for them, you don't have this limitless source of goodwill to draw on. So you've got to write the narrative for someone. You've got to show them how this is going to help them. The last question in the quickfire round that we're going to have time for, because we're at the hour now, so just a very quick one, Jules, is data democratization. And it relates to this question from Brad here. He says, we have a glut of data that's unused by the vast majority. is there an education piece from stewardship to analysis for everyone in the clinic or hospital setting? Do you believe in democratizing access to data so that more veterinary teams can become more data-driven and make more data-informed decisions from vet to the receptionist, sort of one vet team?
I absolutely believe in the democratization of data. I'm not sure that's the use case I would use for it. I think, again, I think the function of some of the stewards within the practice are to deliver actionable data. I don't think it comes down to the democratization of data to the entire team necessarily. I think it's the functional use of those data at the role level. So when I think about the democratization of data, I think more about things like Vet Compass, and can we use data that are reliably recorded and have a standard to and democratize those data to reach meaningful goals together. So I think the democratization of data in the clinic, absolutely. I think everyone should have access to the data they need, but I think it's probably it's probably optimistic to say that democratizing data will change the way people do things. I think to your point, Tom, the what's in it for me and how is it going to make me better at my job or provide better service. I think that's our job to provide to them based on the data.
Well, this has been a super interesting conversation, Jules. Data,
anyway,
yeah, for the two of us, we enjoyed it, and that's the main thing. That's the main thing.
Are there other people here? You didn't tell me there'd be people. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we had a good few questions in there, and there's some that we didn't get around to answering. So maybe I can pass that on to you, Jules, and you can decide if you want to follow up on those.
Absolutely.
For people that want to sort of hear more from you, maybe learn a bit about the work you're doing at Nationwide, where can they find you?
So LinkedIn is a great place for just, I think, connecting with me and seeing what we're doing on a daily basis. I try and put any work that we're doing on the data side there. I think I'm on a panel at VIS next month, and anybody who's coming to or willing to come to Kansas City with its massive increase in Delta variant, we'll see. But generally speaking, LinkedIn is the best place to find me. Petinsurance.com for any information about what we do at Nationwide. But I'll see everyone at the next thing where you can see humans in real life, I guess. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. We do have someone that's incredibly disappointed that there was no cat walking across your Indiana Jones style.
I don't know if you see it. I don't know if we'll get him. This is a little bit of performance anxiety now.
Yeah.
I think he's in the bedroom. He's not.
The perils of live TV. At least I know I've got a delivery.
I
the
should have
cat
thought about
didn't arrive.
He's got stage fright now.
No, that's all good. Thank you very much, Jules. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. And thanks to all of you for attending. You can find more webinars on the PetsApp blog. Head across to petsapp.com. Book a demo with us. We'd love to show you what we've built and share some of the data that we've collected. Thank you all. Until next time, goodbye.
Could be larger than life, bigger than the world, living out the hopes and dreams of every boy and every girl. You could fly higher than the sky, shine brighter than the stars. You could have all you ever wanted, shoot the moon and reach for Mars. You know you could. Yeah, and times are changing everywhere. Do we dream and do we dare? It's up to you, the door is open wide. Feel the rhythm of today, learn the part and join the play. The world is here, let's take it for a ride. You could be larger than life.